few nights ago, I overheard my husband Joe speaking to our son Micha. Spider-Man's uncle always told him that with great power comes great responsibility. To be clear, this is a first century adage that has been used in many other places like Marvel movies. Micha, who is now 3 years old, has recently encountered comic book superheroes and has been particularly curious about Spider-Man and Batman. And it has been wonderful to receive so many questions, and comic book characters lend themselves to narrative about family dynamic and the struggle with implementing a certain set of values. Micha's face was somewhat perplexed when Joe said, "With great power comes great responsibility," and wanted a follow-up explanation. Frankly, I wanted a follow-up explanation. And while my 3-year-old struggled with what that means, I too wondered what that means in our world today. And while I was very touched by this lovely interaction on so many levels, it made me pause for a moment and realize how we've missed the mark on taking responsibility for the greater good in many ways. Like many of you, I have been struck by recent incidences in our world. The racist hate crimes in Buffalo, New York, yet another school shooting in Uvalde, Texas. The painful blow that Roe v. Wade is being overturned, the backdrop of the ongoing war in Ukraine, and so much more. All of these things have taken a toll on our souls and hearts, and worse, the unnecessary death of so many. How can all of these things be happening in our world at the same time? We send thoughts and prayers to those in pain, which may temporarily relieve the ache of the wounded, only to hold us over until the next painful incident. We have the wonderful opportunity to celebrate our LGBTQ community in the month of June, who have also gone through unnecessary mistreatment, and many of these struggles still remain for our LGBTQ brothers and sisters. Gay pride has a relatively short history in that it dates back no longer than 4 decades. It was first established in the 1970s, marking the first anniversary of the Stonewall riots. These riots were a result of a police raid on the Stonewall Inn on June 27, 1970. The Stonewall Inn was a gay bar on Christopher Street in downtown New York, where the owner, employees, and many other LGBTQ customers were arrested. And this was not the first raid of a gay bar by any means, but it was the first time the community finally pushed back. And in the years since, we try to right the wrong the LGBTQ community has experienced by removing the otherness that has long been attached. So what do we do with all of these painful occurrences that seem to continuously build up? I turn to Torah for a moment. Tonight we begin the book of Numbers, Bamidbar, meaning in the desert. And it's an interesting book in that it lacks the grand familial narrative of Genesis, the theological importance of Exodus, the judicial authority of Leviticus, or the summation of Deuteronomy. Numbers holds the conclusion of the priestly history of Israel from creation to the death of Moses, though we read about Moses' death in Deuteronomy. Numbers is our itinerary from slavery in Egypt to the Promised Land. And it is not just a geographical journey, but more importantly, a spiritual and a societal one. Moses and Joshua are tasked with leading a new generation of Israelites through the desert and must ask, what kind of society will they build to cross the wilderness and reach said promised land? How will this civilization account for their past? What is their image or story they will share of themselves in the future? And how will it affect those after them? And this is the question I glean from this week's Torah portion and ask it about our present. A few weeks ago, I stood here asking the question, who are you? And I suggested that rather than answering the question by naming what we do for a living, we forge more deeply and answer the question by conveying the values we hold and how we shape the world we live in. And this evening, I want to push us even further and ask, how do we want to remember this time in our history? How will the next generation, our children, our grandchildren, look at this time? What are we doing to shape this time in their future in hopes of creating a strong foundation for them? When we see all the hatred in the world around us, we are obligated to take action. And our fight for the marginalized must be a priority because we are witnessing violence on innocent human beings, on children. Our tradition drives us to do justice, mercy, and have compassion for all. And it calls upon us to fight for basic rights and dignity for all people in the month of June, the month of Pride. It calls on us, who are not necessarily LGBTQ, to come out as allies. And I want to argue that this obligation begins in our homes. The fight for injustice begins and ends with understanding. With our families, with our friends, with people we hold near and dear, and sometimes feel uncomfortable to speak about subjects where we disagree. I've heard countless stories about families breaking up because of political or social disagreements. And rather than creating safe spaces at home and learning to have difficult dialogue, we sometimes shy away from these moments as to avoid any kind of conflict, because conflict feels intimidating and sometimes daunting. But the alternative, as we are seeing today, leads to ignorance and in turn violence. And I'd like to share a moment with you that happened in our congregation. I recently sat with a group of teens to talk about the sporting event with Lake Catholic. A boy had a swastika drawn on his leg, and some students noticed it during the sporting event. And when I spoke to our students about the aftermath of this occurrence, I was astonished to learn that this was not the first incident, and that many of their sporting games, a place where teams are supposed to practice good integrity, are often very difficult to get through because racial signs and slurs are thrown around towards multiple minority groups on an ongoing basis. And moreover, when I asked the teens how their friends from school responded to these events, knowing that they were Jewish, I was really disappointed to hear that a majority of the kids didn't have a place to unpack this and other incidents like it. Our students are left to deal with these issues on their own. And when I asked if they would have wanted to hear something from their friends or get a comforting text or have a conversation about the anti-Semitism with their friends or at school, our teens said they were somewhat numb to these occurrences and have gotten used to it. Friends, I'm worried. I'm worried that we are raising a generation of apathetic young people who are becoming accustomed to witnessing hatred towards themselves and others, and this cannot be. It is dangerous for all minorities. It is dangerous for Jews, straight, gay, black, all people. Our preliminary job at this time is to create safe places for people to share their feelings and thoughts about the world around them, so that they feel heard. And this is not trite or a cliche. When people allow unresolved matters to fester, it can lead to aggression. And through these kinds of conversations, we create opportunities for acceptance and understanding. We must not steer away from dialogue because it's hard. Because silence generated by disagreement leads to assumptions about the other and further distances people. Without self-expression and discussion, we will continue to witness the increase of bullying, ostracizing, and violence. We must find and create the spaces to affirm ourselves and others in order to push bigotry out. Tomorrow night, as Rabbi Cohen mentioned, is the holiday of Shavuot, where we rejoice in accepting our Torah. And our Torah is not just writing on parchment or a story we read each week, but a responsibility. Each and every one of us have a great responsibility to each other and to our world. And I truly hope that this Shavuot will inspire continued works of goodness for a more peaceful future. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.